Welcome everyone to the first ever VHS Tapes session, a series of virtual talks hosted by the National Videogame Museum and the Videogame Heritage Society with interesting people from the wide world of preservation, collection and exhibition. It's been one whole year, we think, because time has sort of changed since last year, but we launched the VHS at the BFI in London. So from the infamous sort of basement group of institutions we had together and the white paper produced by James Newman and Ian Simons, in the last year, we've seen this huge thriving community online of preservation that is probably also sometimes based in basements. As part of our commitment for advocating for preservation, collection and exhibition, I'm thrilled that we are able to finally embark on this series of talks. It's nice to see some names I absolutely recognize from the VHS forums. I'd like to welcome those of you who are not from the forums. If you go to vhs.themvm.org, you can join in with the conversations that we're having as well. I think we've got it all, that you're all muted. There we go. Lex has just posted in the chat the link. I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Mikey. I'm from a curator at the MVM. And we've also got Lex and Claire from the MVM moderating and helping make this show actually happen with all the hard work that they deserve to be credited for. So thank you for that. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you get your questions in the chat or think of some questions while we're talking, absolutely looking forward to hearing from you. Without further ado, I might as well introduce our guests. We have Dan Wood and Ravi Abbott, 2/3 of the epic Retro Hour podcast. I've got a short bio here that I'm legally obliged to read out for you. Dan is an avid hardware collector with an extensive collection of over 80 systems and a fantastic YouTube channel, which I was watching your video about the Raspberry Pi, the new Raspberry Pi keyboard edition just yesterday. I'm sure they're two topics that we'll be discussing further. Ravi is a retro enthusiast and a collector, also a YouTuber, also a music producer and a DJ with an Amiga as DJ Formula. And again, I was watching and listening to some of your sets that are on YouTube yesterday. They were great. Both of them have been involved in organising the first sort of retro gaming events and festivals in the UK. And Ravi's now also part of the editorial team for the brand new Amiga Addict magazine, which is it in its third issue
Yeah, we're
now?
just printing our third issue, so that should be out next week.
That's awesome. Well, Dan and Ravi, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for inviting us on, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Well, I think this is great. It's a really good way to start, having two people embedded within sort of the British retro scene. I think it's fantastic. I'm really excited about our conversation today. How's the pod going, for starters?
Oh, Dan, do you want to tell him?
Yeah, well, it's been, like everyone, it's been a very weird year for us. I mean, this time last year, we were recording the show each week in a local radio station studio that I work at during the day. So we're in a professional broadcast studio. All the engineering was taken care of for us. All we had to do is rock up, hit record. Then all of a sudden, COVID struck, and Ravi and Joe weren't allowed in the building anymore. And at the time, actually, we were looking to build our own studio in town here in Nottingham, looking at properties and about to put deposits down as well. Yeah. And then we suddenly had to work from home like everyone. So it's been a bit of a learning curve. I mean, I think we've managed to keep the show consistent over the last 12 months, but, setting up home studios and being dropped in the deep end. And then we had that weird time when suddenly nobody was going out and commuting anymore. And you think how a lot of people listen to podcasts. It was in the car or on trains or buses. So we had a bit of a month probably back in March last year where the audience kind of dipped quite a bit and we were like, oh, what's going on here? But actually then, by the end of the summer, the audience had gone sky high. And I think year on year, we've nearly doubled our audience in the last about 18 months. So yeah, we're actually in a better place than we were this time last year.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because every episode we interview someone, and like usually our demographic, it was around 35 to 45, and after COVID, it's changed to around 18 to 24 as being a huge group in our demographic, and we're amazed that younger people are really getting into the history of video games. And when we were younger, we were looking back at the kind of older games and stuff. So it's cool to see the new generation getting involved and wanting to find out about history and preservation.
Do you find that now with this new demographic, you're getting questions about systems that you haven't really spoken about before?
Yeah, quite a few. And Dan's had very young people contact him as well. He's had like 13-year-olds asking for tips on how to use machines and stuff. And yeah, it's really interesting to have all these young folks involved, you know.
Yeah, I get them on my YouTube channel. People like, I'm a teenager. I've heard about the Amiga, what a big machine it was. I want to get one off eBay. Can you tell me what parts I need and how to hook it up? And, these machines that were like, double their age last time they were on the market. So I think because video games and computers in general are everywhere now, and obviously video games being the biggest form of entertainment in the world, I think there are a lot of people that are kind of looking at the legacy and kind of where they came from and are interested in the roots of it.
Absolutely. I was watching a documentary about the Amiga yesterday. I think it was the one that you contributed to, Dan, the Nerd Historian, the two-part about the Amiga. And it's a fascinating part of history that it's not really my wheelhouse until working with the VHS. But learning about just how big it was in the UK, it's insane. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the fact that Ravi is like working on a commercial magazine, commercially and crowdfunded magazine in 2021 that comes out every month dedicated to the Amiga just shows you what an active scene there is around that machine in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's start off with maybe asking about what the first systems that you remember hooking you when you were a kid, and then maybe at what point did you start collecting video game material and hardware?
Go for it, Ravi.
I think the first system that hooked me was the Amstrad PCW, and I was running early Windows 3.1. I was doing a bit of MS-DOS on there as well. I think my mum later upgraded, but the machines were used for like word processing and stuff, so it was like, oh, I could play games on this as well. And then that got me hooked, so I kind of started learning about that, but it was very command line based. And then I got the Amiga. And my dad was working at Trent University, actually. So Nottingham Trent had replaced their whole media suite with Amigas. So we got like the Amiga 2000. It was all used in the fine art department for animation. And we had that at home, and I didn't know I could play games on it. So my dad kind of shoved it in the attic and said, play on Deluxe Paint, which was the animating one. So I'd just be drawing and creating stuff. And then later on, I kind of got into collecting stuff around the PlayStation period. Like before, I didn't have the finances. Being a young kid, you're always reliant on your parents' money and stuff, and you can't really get into collecting until kind of a system really gets out of trend, and then you can buy all the stuff cheap or get it in the sales. So, my collecting started a lot later on.
Yeah, I think for me, my parents actually worked in the industry. My mum was a mainframe operator in the 70s, and she used to, program in like COBOL and Pascal and all these kind of ancient programming languages. And my dad was an electronic engineer and a circuit board designer. So, my dad built them and my mum programmed them. So it was kind of in my DNA that when I was a kid, I remember when I'd been about 5-6 years old, normally when your mum would sit you on a knee and read Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we were programming in fruit machine simulators in BASIC into the Commodore Plus/4, which was my first machine. That I think I got that for Christmas one year, because I'd used the BBC Micros at school, and they kind of really captured my attention, and really got me obsessed really with computers. I remember wanting one so badly. I'm not sure whether I should admit this really. I actually made my own little computer out of a tissue box and some little sticky on labels and stuff to pretend I had a computer. I wanted one that badly. And then opening one on Christmas Day when I was like, 6-7 years old, that blew my mind. And I think they got it. It was a Commodore Plus/4 that was a failed product from Commodore that had been on the market a few years earlier. They got it for about £25 and like some clearance, and generally regarded as a terrible system, but because it was the only machine I had, I loved that computer. That really changed my world when I got that machine.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated with the BBC Micro, for sort of catching your imagination, because I actually watched yesterday Micro Men, the film about Sinclair and Chris Curry, and it seemed to just be this computing phenomenon back in the 1980s.
Dan
We
was
actually
a
had.
bit, Dan was
Sorry,
a
go
bit
ahead.
older, so Dan was in the proper micro period where all the schools were full of micros. I had the period where it went to Acorn and the Acorn CD-ROM stuff, but we still had a few BBC micros hanging around, so you'd kind of play with them. But yeah, I was massively Acorn influenced and Archimedes and Riscos, but Dan was total BBC bloke, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I used to be at my school. We had, when I was about 7 years old, we had 4 BBC computers in our school, 2 BBC Masters and 2 BBC Bs as well. And it shows you how much things have changed. Overnight, we used to actually lock them up in a massive iron safe, put them away with an Allen key, to look after them. They were that valuable with the Cub CRT monitors. And every morning, I mean, it was probably a bit like child labor thinking back. When I was 7 years old, I get into school at like 8:30 in the morning and help the teachers unpack them and put them onto trolleys and then wheel them into the classrooms to use. And yeah, I love doing it though, and setting the disk drives up. And I remember you had to plug them in underneath. It was really fiddly. But yeah, the BBC was just a wonderful machine. And we did stuff like the programming language Logo. I was lucky enough to have a teacher called Mrs. Moore who was like really into computers, and she would spend a lot of time with us doing like robot turtles on the floor, and we do all that kind of stuff. And then she'd let us stay after school actually while she was doing marking, me and my friend Gary, that were really into computers. And we tried to do text adventures, making our own text adventure games on the BBC Micro, and they were never very good. And doing terrible Christmas cards that we printed out on the 9-pin dot matrix printers that I'm sure my relatives were thrilled to receive. But yeah, it was such a game changer. And I think you can thank the BBC Micro for a massive part of what we have today in Britain, really opening up people's minds to using personal computers.
And that logo system was really good fun. It was a giant turtle that you put a pencil inside, and then the kids did the coordinates, and it would basically draw a huge picture. But also when they had the Acorn machines, they had robot arms as well. And that was a big thing where kids would have robot arms and they'd be able to say, go forwards, close, pick up a cup, move about. And it was all about coordinates and working in the kind of 3 dimensions.
And learning how to do obscene gestures with them as well was quite entertaining.
Yeah, I don't think they'd ever let us at school would trust us with any of that technology. We just get a computer, copy and paste, and maybe play pinball on a Windows 98. I think that's the extent of our computing courses at school. I think it's. I mean, the Raspberry Pi seems to me to be that sort of successor of the BBC Micro in the sort of democratizing computing for younger age groups.
Well, there was a dumbing down of computer teaching in the UK. So it basically went to information technology, which turned into learn how to use Office, learn how to use a printer. And before you were programming, you were doing all this kind of creative stuff, and they were treating kids with a bit more intelligence. But then later on, it changed. The curriculum did, but the Raspberry Pi seems to have chucked it back to that kind of way of working and getting kids into coding with Scratch,
which is good
stuff like that.
Which is good to see as well. Because I mean, I left school in 1997. So by the time I'd left, at the end of my school time, we were using Windows 95 with PC CD-ROMs and everything on it as well. Like I said, when I started my school journey, it was BBC Micro. So that decade, the mid 80s to the mid 90s, so much changed then. And I noticed that as well, that by the end of school, we were just using Word and learning Excel. Encarta, I forgot about Encarta. Yeah. So it was, it wasn't so much learning how the machine worked, it was just doing things with them. And that was a difference, I think. Yeah,
I totally agree. Because I just saying the word Encarta brings back so many memories of trying to learn about ancient Egypt and not succeeding. So do you think that have you noticed how the Raspberry Pi sort of changed the landscape in now for people, like for sort of programming for younger people, and then just more broadly for computer programming in general?
It's crazy because the Pi, when it kind of started off, I noticed people were like making weather stations from them. There were a lot of kind of educational projects, but now it seems to be taken on by the wider retro community. So I've got a bit of kit here.
Oh,
that I can show you, and this is It's called Pi Hat 1541. And this, as you can see, is a Commodore 64 floppy drive, exactly emulated in a Raspberry Pi. So you just put your SD card in and it will load exactly like a floppy drive. And there's loads of these little solutions that are happening now. So even in the BBC Micro, you can put the Raspberry Pi in there and use it as a co-processor. So it's actually kind of designed that way so you can get a huge speed up. And, you know, the fact that they're incredibly cheap as well, I think really helps. And loads of people have started using them. There was this thing, Magpie magazine, and they released a Raspberry Pi Zero on it. And it was like the ultimate evolution because, you know, you'd start off with floppy disks coming on a magazine, CD-ROMs, and then in the end of it, you get a whole computer. It comes on the front.
Yeah, it is great. We actually had, we were fortunate enough to have Evan Upton be a guest on our podcast not long ago, actually, probably about a year ago. Yeah, and he was saying at the time that he wanted to make a modern BBC Micro. Essentially, he was that influenced by that machine. And I think, didn't he actually go to the BBC to try and get endorsement?
They did a thing called the Micro Bit, which was going to be used and put out in educational areas. I don't think that's been as successful as the Pi, but it might still have a user base and be used for educational purposes.
Yeah, 'cause I do a lot of YouTube videos about the Raspberry Pi, and they're often my most popular videos I do, just because I think, like Ravi said, they're so affordable. I mean, I think I've got about 7 or 8 of them, just in all different uses around the house. Some of them in a drawer, you know, looking for a use. I tend to buy every new model that comes out just because they are cheap and I'll find something to do with them. But I think we even see stuff like, at the moment, there's like a text adventure jam going on where people are making text adventure games, and a lot of those are doing it on the Raspberry Pi, and you see a lot of indie games have been developed on there. And in emulation, I mean, so many people use Raspberry Pis in mini arcade cabinets and emulating other machines. You know, the Raspberry Pi 400 that you mentioned, which is an all-in-one keyboard computer, a real throwback to machines that I grew up with, you know, the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, that all-in-one design. So I think a lot of the retro computer enthusiasts and old school video gamers have really taken the Raspberry Pi under their wing.
And the maddest thing that I've seen on the Raspberry Pi is TFAX. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a version of teletext that actually is hosted on the Raspberry Pi. And you can plug it into your old TV with a remote and press teletext, and it will actually access teletext like the old system, but it's been taken over by the fans. It's updated. It's got modern news on there. Totally crazy. Lots of art and pictures and loads of jokes and quizzes. Bamboozle's still there and stuff. So there's so many uses for these little beautiful devices.
And there used to be a daily video games magazine on teletext called Digitizer, which I believe is back on there again now on the new teletext. So yeah, you can relive it on there.
That's amazing. I wonder where sort of the emulation capabilities of the Pi come into sort of conversations about sort of authenticity. You know, how people want to get their hands on the old console, but like that, having that Pi and having the ability to, you know, emulate so many different systems through it, it must just be such a boon for the retro community to be able to do it so much more quickly and simply without having to have all this hardware that might not work, or you might not have the right input for it.
As it's kind of developed, software's developed. So like RetroPie is one of the kind of installations that you have. And when they very first started, they were really hard to configure. You know, you had to get all the pads and put all your own input in and stuff. And now it's like all auto detected. It runs really well. But there's also an argument because if you're using the Pi, it's still software emulation. And there's a thing which is it's kind of hardware emulation, which is called FPGA, which is a fully programmable gate array, which is basically before they're creating a chip, they'll create it in FPGA, and then they create it in ASIC, which is like a later version. So this kind of works like the real hardware. And I've used stuff like Raspberry Pi emulator, and it feels like there's a little bit of lag, there's a little frame missing or something. And you use this FPGA and it just feels like the real hardware. It's absolutely amazing.
I know what you're saying, though. It's kind of I think it's a halfway house, really, because Ravi mentioned projects there, like using the Raspberry Pi kind of twinned with classic systems. Like, you know, I saw something the other day. someone who actually made a little plugin that you can put a Raspberry Pi Zero inside an Amiga 500 and use it as an HDMI output. So using the power of the Raspberry Pi, you can enhance the original machine using it, which makes sense because it's cheap commodity hardware rather than designing something from scratch. But I must admit, in terms of emulation, I actually spend more time setting up emulators on Raspberry Pis than I do actually using them. I'll dedicate a whole weekend to making, like, the ultimate Amiga 1200 setup, and then at the end of it, I'm like, all right, well, I'll put that away now. I'd rather use my original system again. But it's more, I think, for people that haven't got that original hardware, though, because, I mean, not everyone's got, like, 80 plus retro machines and an understanding partner like I have, cramming up their house. So for people who just want that kind of blast of nostalgia on an affordable system, and it runs so well these days, like Ravi said, I mean, I remember trying to do emulation on the original Raspberry Pi, and it was so slow. But now, in terms of speed, I mean, the Raspberry Pi 400 can emulate an Amiga 500 about 200 times faster than the original machine was.
It's getting to about Dreamcast now, isn't it? Dreamcast level that you can kind of do full emulation at 60 frames per second, which is just mad.
That still seems like science fiction to me. Knowing what I've been playing with other emulators, and you feel like you just can't. There's always just something just slightly wrong with them, or you're not getting that exact experience that you want. So to hear that a Dreamcast can be resurrected, as it were, I wonder if you could do. Was it the Dreamcast Online that was sort of reinvigorated?
People are doing that. There is actually, because I've got an original Dreamcast with one of the rare broadband adapters. That I'm not sure whether they ever came out over here or whether they were quite a rare edition. I managed to get a hold of one a few years ago. There are people now who run their own servers. And you can do this with the original Xbox as well, which has been taken offline by Microsoft over a decade ago. But using an Ethernet cable, you can then plug it into your PC and then kind of fool the original console into thinking it's connecting to its service, but actually it's someone's third-party service they've hosted themselves. And there are, there's actually a service you can go on that hosts all the different machines. I can't remember its name off the top of my head. Maybe someone in chat can remember it. But you can go on there, just tell it which machine you're on. And there are actually active communities of people playing, like, Phantasy Star Online and Halo 2, and people who are still living like it's like 2001.
And you could even make a broadband, one of those rare broadband adapters, out of a Raspberry Pi as well. So
exactly.
There's always a solution.
Possibilities with the Raspberry Pi are seemingly endless, really, aren't they? Have you enjoying the sort of new version with the keyboard?
Oh yeah, it's in my cupboard. I think I haven't got it to show at the moment, but yeah, I think because the original Raspberry Pis, or even the Raspberry Pi 4, I remember doing things like trying to use it as a print server for one of my old computers, so it could connect to my Wi-Fi printer. But then I needed to get a serial port in there and had to put it off the GPIO pins inside, and it looked a bit messy hanging out the case. But now those are exposed on the back of the Raspberry Pi 400. It's more like looks like an IDE port on the back, so you can just plug things straight into it. Makes it a lot tidier. And I think especially if you've got a machine when we can eventually visit places and go around friends' houses, for a little portable emulation machine, not having to remember to bring a USB keyboard and everything. And I think it is a really tidy little machine. And like I said, I've always loved that kind of all-in-one computer design as well. I've kind of missed that. I've realized when I've got the Raspberry Pi again, having it all in there is quite cool.
And it kind of helps continue technologies that have been abandoned. So Steam Link, they no longer make the Steam Link devices, and they were really good for people wanting to play in the living room and play remotely. And Raspberry Pi, there's actually a version of Steam Link for that now, so you can create your own Steam Link with Raspberry Pi, connect to that, stream to your TV. It's just nuts.
That is awesome. I'm trying to think of how I could reconfigure a Raspberry Pi to as a PlayStation TV, because I feel like
there's a way.
Yeah, there must be
someone will have done it.
Because what's better than a PS Vita? A PS Vita on a massive TV. So surely there must be a way. And
it's got a great community around it though as well, and you find that with the Raspberry Pi, because a lot of people that buy it are tinkerers. They're interested in coding and how technology works, and they'll find a way to do it. If not, they'll go on the forums, and other people will think, they'll ask someone, and someone else will give them a bit of advice, and before you know it, you've got a team who are working on a project, and then it happens.
And there's a huge third-party market. So because people have been doing this for years, if you want a solar panel to run your Raspberry Pi, or if you want a battery kit or something, it will be available, and you'll just be able to get it straight away and it'll all work.
I'm really impressed with the resilience of this retro community of like making things work and innovating on new stuff, and like the fact that this Amiga community is still so thriving even 20 years on from the height of the Amiga. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I think with the Amiga, it's something a bit different where, like, you know, everybody thought it was ahead. They thought it was a really good machine, and then they were all let down and burnt at the same time. So there's this kind of mad passion that one day we'll get it back and try and reignite it. And it may be a bit delusional, but, you know, it does drive a lot of passion and development. So I've got an Amiga Cd 32 here, which was the last console. This was the kind of second console that Commodore released after the CD TV, and this was their like last breath. I think it was only 6 months on the market, and it was a big failure. But they've created an expansion board here at the back. This is called a Kipper2k board, and this board actually enables you to have RGB out. You can have a keyboard in there. I've got a compact flash drive in there and an accelerator. So essentially, it turns it into a full Amiga. Let me just give it a pull. Yeah, it turns it into a full Amiga. And this is kind of technology that's been developed as a cheap solution by the fans. So this is it. And there's a new version coming, which is going to have wireless support on it and stuff. And just these cool little expansions and tiny devices that previously would have cost hundreds of pounds are just being made in basements and like little small studios at home. And you know, the availability of stuff like 3D printing and being able to create PCBs really cheap and, you know, using your own equipment is actually pushing this whole little hobbyist market that seems to have emerged. And it's always a case of you need the hardware before you get the software. And we've seen a lot of software coming out, a lot of hardware coming out, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for the Amiga, which is great. And it means that software development's actually started, and we're seeing some amazing original software getting created. For years, it was just ports. Like there to go, oh look, we can run this, or we can run this, but it would be a PC game. Yeah, Doom ports for years.
Yeah, so, I agree with Ravi as well. I mean, I've got an Amiga 600 next to me. That was, again, it was a machine that wasn't really well received at the time. It was like quite a cut down Amiga 500, kind of a cost reduced version of it. But then a couple of years ago, if I can show this on camera, you can see there's a little board there, that way. This is called a Vampire. And what this does is it sits over the CPU of the Amiga 600, and then it speeds it up by about 200 times. It gives it, you can decode MPEG audio with it. It's got HDMI out. It's got about 16 million colors on there. When I installed that and then watched one of my YouTube videos on an Amiga 600 from 1992 on my HD flat screen TV, that kind of blew my mind a bit, I must admit.
And this is the full kind of setup of this. So it's got a compact flash in there. It's got a processor as well. And this whole thing is kind of like basically boosts the whole machine to turn it into a full Amiga that's usable, which is just crazy.
That is amazing. Do you find that like within that Amiga community, do you get the same sort of innovations between like Atari Jaguar community or, you know, the CD rock?
All of it's cross compatible. So that board, for example, that Dan has, you can boot it into an Atari mode. This is an 060 chip, which is compatible, 040s as well, compatible with the Mac Classic operating system. So you can run OS 9, the old Macintosh stuff, on the Amiga as well. So there's a lot of like cross compatibility. You can also flash stuff onto different machines. So there's one called the FPGA Mister at the moment where you can run Neo Geo on it. You can run the Acorn, Vectrex. Like I think there's about 20 or 30 different cores that you can use on that, and they're all at different development stages depending on the kind of fan community. But I must say, I think Amiga seems to be the crazy pioneer in the technology, and then it spills out to the other other areas, and Dreamcast as well. Dreamcast are really, really popular at the moment, and people are releasing games and making hardware for the Dreamcast quite a lot.
Yeah, machines like the Commodore 64 have got quite a good active development scene around them as well. You know, I've got a Commodore 64 behind me with a Wi-Fi expansion card, so I can get it on the internet. This machine was made in 1982. You can't do a lot on the internet, admittedly, with it, but you can hook it up. And also, I mean, I remember going to the computer at the Centre of Computing in Cambridge. I know we have some people here from there, and seeing their Commodore 64 set up with one of the expansions, and actually watching video playing on the Commodore 64, which, you know, this was an 8-bit computer from the early 80s. And the fact that people are doing this kind of thing with it just blows my mind. And in terms of consoles, I mean, we have things like, I'm sure a lot of people have seen these, flash carts. This one here is for a Sega Mega Drive. This is called an EverDrive, and the guy who makes these, he does them for like Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64. But what it means is you can have an SD card for all of your games that I'm sure you legally own already onto these, insert it into your machine, turn it on, you get a menu, and you can play every game ever made for the Mega Drive off this little cartridge. If you'd showed that to me when I was 12 years old, I wouldn't have believed it. It's like how far we've come on. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's that's insane. I mean, to tell a young boy in the 1980s you're going to be able to play every single game almost ever conceived just through these little tiny little devices.
Yeah,
with such a sort of innovative community. I feel like there's the side that makes all these games playable, and the people that are innovative with technology to make games playable on these systems. But there's also like different ways of using the systems entirely that I wouldn't have even thought of. So I'm thinking about Ravi with your Amigas doing DJing. Like that just seems very left field.
Well, they were always creative computers, and like it's turning it into using another purpose. So like this is a thing called LSDJ, which is a cart for the Game Boy, and you can actually that's been developed. There's one called Nano Loops as well, and you can put it into your Game Boy. You can sync them with cables, so you could have 25 Game Boys hooked up, all have them doing different things, and it just turns them into something different, like an instrument. And people are really missing that sound as well. Like, it's a really weird thing. When I went to America, all the checkouts, they used the coin collect sound from Sonic. Ding, like that. And I was just like, what is going on? But it sparked something in my mind, and that's moving into the further sound industry. So there's a big jungle movement at the moment of people creating old school jungle using the old school equipment. And this is a brand new piece of equipment that's come out, which is called a Polyend Tracker. And this is based on the old tracker system of kind of creating music in the 4 channels. And this has everything on it. It's like an Amiga in a box. It's got a sampler. It's got a sequencer. You know, you can slice and edit samples in here. It's just absolutely amazing. You can even sample off the radio. So I can try and catch some Dan Wood and then do a little remix. It seems the wider world's kind of paying attention and, you know, looking for new sounds and looking into these genres that were kind of lost, like they used to with everything. Like years ago, house was called Disco's Revenge. It was like, you know, looking back at disco, which is something that had kind of gone out into obscurity and then bringing it back in a new way. So hopefully some of these old school sounds and bass lines and stuff will start to come out in modern music, and there'll be a new kind of scene.
Because you talk about, you know, the stuff Ravi does, and for people that haven't seen him, he actually DJs using 2 Amiga 1200 computers, and I've seen him performing with, you know, DJ Yoda, who's like, you know, is a megastar DJ. He was doing a video games music tour, and Ravi warmed up for him, and hearing Ravi plays Amiga 1200s on a club sound system, you know, this thing was booming. It shook the fillings in your teeth. And the music, I mean, I've been an Amiga fan since the early 90s. I didn't know it could sound that good. It blew my mind that you could even do that with an Amiga.
Well, the thing is as well, I think a lot of people miss that old sound, because if you listen to everything now, once CDs came out, everything kind of got put in the mid area. It was all compressed. It was all nicely leveled out. And if you remember all those old clubs and those old kind of tapes and stuff like that, nothing was level. It was all over the place, and the bass was just horrific. And, you know, the highs were really high. There'd be really bad samples and stuff, but that aesthetic people still really enjoy. So, you know, it's a very noticeable difference when you're hearing something that's really got that genuine old school sound, and then you're hearing something coming out of like a modern little mixer where somebody's doing it off 320 kilobit MP3s or something, but it's still kind of got that compressed or leveled out output where there's really no leveling going on. With the old school stuff, it's all recorded in bedrooms or, you know, stolen samples.
Yeah, and I think there's been a big movement towards that kind of people wanting to recapture that old school kind of gritty sound in music. I mean, we saw the Chemical Brothers, who Ravi's told me that they made their last album using real hardware, real sequencers and synthesizers, not using like Logic on a Mac, for example. So, you know, there are a lot of younger musicians who are coming in and trying to get machines like the Atari ST and the Amiga because it's got that kind of really raw sound that you can't quite emulate using modern machines.
And stuff like synthesizers as well, and stuff like Stranger Things. And, you know, it's kind of entering popular culture again when you'd have stuff like Attack on Precinct 13 with John Carpenter's original kind of synthy sound, and that would be in films for a long, long time, and then it just dropped off. So there's a lot of nostalgia for that, and people kind of have that little section of their brain that's waiting for a bit of John Carpenter style synth, and then when they hear it, really get excited. And you know,
yeah, do you almost feel like partly that the internet's also sort of, again, this sort of concept of time's sort of not really being a thing, but like all these older sounds and older things are just are like concurrent and current. You just at a click of a button, you could be taken, you know.
it's to a degree, because also you're listening on different stuff. You're not listening on the old 1970s amps that you used to have, or you're not or for example, you've got those earbud kind of phones, and stuff sounds very different on those, you know. And kids will be sitting there with their little phone, and you'll just hear this tinny kind of sound coming there and no real bass. But you remember cars used to like wobble the area when they went with bass. So there's a bit of difference. But I'm even running an old school 70s amp here at the moment.
Well, even with video game music, I mean, most of us used to listen to that back in the day on, you know, coming out the little speaker on a CRT TV.
Or on cassette, or you record it on cassette as well.
Yeah, so very different.
Speaking of a CRT TV, when you use a Raspberry Pi, do you get that? Does it try and emulate the way that a CRT TV has the lines on the screen?
You can use stuff like RetroArch, which is like a big emulation package, like a front end, and a lot of the emulators in there have like scanline filters, they call it, to make it look a bit more like that. I'll be honest, for me, it doesn't really satisfy my craving for it being the original. I mean, I'm more of a real hardware kind of guy, because I remember when I got kind of back into retro stuff, probably around 2007-8, when I got myself an Amiga again off eBay. Sadly threw all my original machines out back in the day, but we won't go into that. And then just tried loads of different screens and thought, why don't the games look like I remember? And I remember a friend of mine came over and we used to play a game called Cannon Fodder. We used to play it loads when we were at school. Fantastic game. And we're playing that again, you know, when we're in our 30s. And he's like, he's looking at it, he goes, I don't remember it looking this bad. And I'm like, yeah, me neither. We're playing it on a modern TV, a 1080p flat screen LCD TV that had shown every artifact and every mistake with the graphics. But then you look at it on an old CRT. I went back to my parents and luckily still had my old 14-inch Philips CRT monitor, which is actually behind me right there. I don't know if you can see it. Brought that down, plugged it in, and then my eyes nearly welled up. I was like, this is how I remember the games looking. So I've always found that with the retro scene, a lot of people will go out and they'll buy a Sega Mega Drive from 1990 or a Super Nintendo, but then they'll hook it up to their 50-inch LCD TV. I feel like, you know, if you've gone 90% of the way of getting the original hardware, invest in the thing you're going to spend all your time looking at to make sure that's the original as well. I think there is a big part of that.
And I think they had a bit of a bad rep as well, because lots of people were using, you know, triple copied videotapes on a one or a badly tuned aerial. And, you know, if you get a multi-sync CRT monitor and you hook it up with RGB and you have that RGB out from a machine, nothing beats it. Like I show my mates and they come round and just the level of blackness on there.
Mm.
If you're looking at a Starfield or something, it's just mind-blowing. Literally, like Dan said, you could just turn it on and be like, wow, this is stunning. So for demos and old gaming and stuff, definitely recommend using one, and use a monitor, not a television. Like monitors with the RGB input, oh, lovely.
It is weird because like 10 years ago, people couldn't give CRT TVs and monitors away. I've got a few. I mean, I got that one at my attic. Since then, I've got around 6 around me now in this room alone for my old school systems. Maybe a bit carried away. But yeah, now there is actually a market, particularly stuff like the Sony PVMs that were used in broadcast environments. You know, TV stations used to use them for color balancing and seeing what broadcasts would look like before they went on air. But now there's a real big collector's market for those, and some of those go for like ridiculous many thousands of pounds now if you want to get hold of those, which is crazy. You know, people were selling them for like 99 pence a decade ago. But I think people are realizing that so many people threw out these old monitors and TVs, and now there's becoming a bit of a scarcity around them, I think.
Yeah. I'm now regretting like all the things that I used to take for granted when I was a kid and not having them anymore. I can remember sitting down with the PlayStation for the first time, and like a small little Sony CRT TV, and it just being such a great color experience. And now I'll never get that back unless I can find that TV again, which I probably won't.
I even had a black and white one, so I was playing console games on a tiny little tunable black and white one, but it looked wicked.
Trying to play snooker games on it, that would be challenging.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of the physical collections. You were mentioning sort of the real hardware. So what's your favorite part of your collection, I guess?
I'll show you an oddity that I've got at the moment, which this was taken off the shelf. So this is called Bleem, and it's a really interesting product. So it basically came out, and it was a PlayStation emulator that came out on the PC. And this was during the time that the PlayStation was actually released. So you could use your PC graphics card to actually increase the graphics of the original PlayStation games, put them in and run them off this software. This got taken off the shelves after like tons and tons of court cases. But this was the PC version. And then they released a thing called Bleemcast. And this was amazing because I think this is one of the only instances where you have a console like the PlayStation being emulated on the Saturn. So it's like a console that's released at the moment being emulated on another machine, and the Saturn was technically a bit more superior. So the Dreamcast was technically more superior. So they basically ran the PlayStation games on the Dreamcast and got a little bit of an upgrade. They called it Bleemcast. And this is Gran Turismo 2 that was available for the Dreamcast with a little bit of an upgrade. And
signed copy.
Yeah, and Tekken as well, Tekken 3. So yeah, and you can see that they have the screenshot comparisons. It's a bit like square, and then you've got a bit of a smoothed version. And I just found this amazing because this was actually enabled by using a thing called Mill CD, which was a function that they left in the Dreamcast for like kind of Japanese karaoke discs, and it was never really used, but it enabled them to kind of use this technology and fully opened it up. Amazing programmer called Randy Linden who did those.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my collection, I'm big into computers as well as console, particularly the Amiga that we've talked about. I mean, I've got an Amiga 3000 here in front of me, which was quite a rare Amiga machine. I've got an Amiga 4000 here, which is like the top end Amiga. That I remember in 1992 when I was like, 11 or something. I remember that was selling for about $2,500. So I'd look at that in magazines and be like, yeah, I'm never going to own one of those. Managed to get one for about 300 quid a decade ago. Probably spent more than $2,500 on upgrades for it since. But that was always kind of my dream machine when I was young. So I've got it hooked up to the internet. I've got, an MP3 decoder, so I can listen to internet radio and that installed in it as well. I've got, 24-bit graphics card. I've got all sorts of stuff in there as well. In terms of consoles, I've got, I quite like obscure fail consoles. So this is like a machine. The only one I really collect for, I'm sure some people in
the
chat
old
will remember.
toilet seat they used to call that.
The Atari Jaguar with the working CD edition. I think they're getting quite rare these days. They released that at the end of the console's life when no one really cared about it. I think about 7 games came out for it, the CD edition, and then I've got a flash cart in the top. But again, I mean, the community have taken that under their wings now, and you can actually get a lot of homebrew games that have been released for the Atari Jaguar CD that are still coming out today. I think there was like 2 or 3 came out year before last. So there is still quite an active scene around them. And I mean, I've got, machines like, I've got a Philips CDI behind me as well, that again, when I was a kid, I remember seeing those in shops and thinking, that's going to be the future. That's going to change everything. We're never going to watch TV again. It's going to be CDI everything. Colossal failure. But again, because it was hyped up so much when I was young, it was something that I've always wanted to own. And I do kind of like, there is something slightly, obviously there were tragedies that people put all this work in. You have these teams and companies lost millions, in some cases billions of pounds on these systems that didn't realize their full potential. But I think there are interesting stories behind them as well. And often you'll find, I mean, like on the Atari Jaguar, there are, a handful. I think there's only about 70 games in total on the system. But there are a handful of games that are really good. And some games like Rayman, which, obviously a massive franchise, started on the Atari Jaguar as an exclusive game on that platform. So that was a machine it was designed for. And there's also something about seeing the original game and that vision that the developers had in the first place, that original version of it. There's something quite interesting in that, I think, as well.
And another thing I collect is video game vinyl. So these are some of the original ones. So they'd have like Super Mario Land, which was that awful rap version that came out. Lemmings Rave album as well. Mortal Kombat. But these were the original ones. But there's a whole new scene now as well. So this is Streets of Rage 2, and this is a company called Data Discs, and they're releasing these kind of classic versions and really beautiful double vinyls and stuff. And there's a massive collecting scene now of retro video game vinyls, which is a whole other area you could go into.
It's like, 10 years ago, CRT TVs, no, couldn't give them away. Probably the same with vinyls. Maybe I was going to say, the vinyl craze has been going on, and it's not really a craze now. If it's been going on for quite a while, hasn't it? A resurgence of vinyl.
Well, I think there was a point where everybody just sold their vinyl collection, and it was like one of the most heartbreaking things. You'd have all these friends that would have these amazing collections, and then suddenly, I just sold it all, mate. Yeah.
Well, even like things that, again, talking about things you couldn't give away 10 years ago that now people are wanting, things like this. If anyone remembers zip drives. I remember there's a YouTuber called LGR did a video on this, and all of a sudden these are selling for quite a bit on eBay again now. This was an obscure it was actually quite popular for a couple of years in the late 90s between, when people used floppy disks and USB keys coming in and writable CD-ROMs. But again, I mean, these can have like 100 megabytes. It was kind of a floppy disk replacement. But now things like this, people are wanting them. I think a big part of that is because people like LGR YouTubers are doing these videos on these things that maybe, a lot of their audience might be younger than when these were on the market and actually curious about them as well. I think there's a lot of that comes into it.
And these like Bernoulli multi-discs, which were like 150 megabyte and absolute monsters. And they were used for like old video storage and stuff like that. Yeah.
Is that like is that a worm disc? Is that right? Once really many?
You need a Bernoulli drive. That's all I remember. And people used to put them in. I got this from an American video editor. So they were video editing back in the days with these, and these would be used to store some of the video footage. 150 megabytes of video footage.
Well, Ravi's also a mini disc enthusiast.
Yeah.
So, as well, aren't you? Yeah. Obscure formats. Big in the day, but not now.
Dead formats.
Yeah.
But with cycles of life, they'll come back in, and everyone will want to be a mini disc collector.
Well, amazingly, now actually people are starting to release stuff for older systems. So, like the Dreamcast, people are releasing stuff just to, they'll release on the Dreamcast as well as releasing a new indie game, just to get headlines or to get popular stuff. Like these games have just been released on the Wii, which is, the Wii's not had many games for a long time. I think it was just Dance Series that.
2012 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, and these were actually licensed, and the guy held onto the license for a long time. And these have actually been licensed by Nintendo North America, so they're actually official ones. And this is a Retro City Rampage, which is a kind of GTA style game, and Shakedown Hawaii, but also he's got a Wii U release as well. So amazing to see these coming out for consoles that are supposedly discontinued or don't have any extra life, and they're just breathing life back into them.
They're probably going to be, I mean, till now, they're the last games on the system. I mean, that might change.
It's almost as if it's almost more surprising to see it on the Wii U than it is to see it on the Wii.
Yeah.
I realized that time has absolutely flown having a conversation. So I realized that we could be talking for hours and hours about this. So we'll get to the Q&A so we can get some audience questions for you.
We're just getting warmed up.
I know.
This is a problem getting podcasters on. You know, they don't shut up.
It's a good problem because, you know, imagine if I had guests on and they were like, yeah, and just nope.
We've had a few of them.
Oh no. So I'm not sure the best way to do this sort of Q&A time, questions in the chat.
A great question from Connor. So Connor, I'm going to invite you to, I'm going to deactivate your microphone, and if you want to ask the question yourself, that might be the best way of doing it.
Thanks, Claire.
Hello, yes, I think I put a couple of questions on there, so I'm trying to think which one. But I think we discussed earlier at the start of the call about how kind of computing education had a bit more of a DIY attitude prior to, you know, the popularization of kind of operating systems like Windows, etc. Do we think that this DIY attitude has had a factor in this hobbyist community that is kind of modding retro hardware? And with that in mind, are these kind of modders or kind of, you know, hobbyist community, are they doing similar things for post 2000s kind of consoles, like, you know, or like we spoke about the Dreamcast, but is that going to be a thing?
Yeah, I think the kind of philosophy that came out of that and the way that people worked, you know, creating stuff themselves, coding, went into the later stuff, like when HTML came out, and, you know, even when the IT changed, people were still kind of innovating. I think with modern consoles, yeah, there's got to be stuff, but it looks like people always seem to kind of aim backwards a bit. So, you know, if you've got a modern console, they'll try and run older stuff on there. So like try and improve them and add on and kind of get them going faster. You know, it's always like, oh, can I run a Vectrex on there or some kind of older system?
And I think, you know, the hardware obviously has become a lot more complicated since, you know, the late 90s machines, and if we're talking after that era. But like Ravi said, I mean, there is like a, you know, hacking scene around machines, like, you know, the Nintendo Switch, when someone figured out you could actually hack into the firmware of that using a paperclip a couple of years ago. Probably not any videos on YouTube about it anymore, because I think Nintendo took them all down. But also, I mean, there are channels like Modern Vintage Gamer. His channel's fantastic, and he recently got, you know, he was emulating old machines on the new Xbox, and there's, you know, people doing that on the PlayStation 5 as well. People, you know, wherever there's a will, there's a way. People find the way into the firmware, and then, like Ravi said, though, they generally tend to get into those machines, and then first thing they do, let's get RetroArch running on there and emulate a machine from 25 years ago.
I couldn't believe that Modern Vintage Gamer video with the new Xbox.
Yeah, there's a developer mode. I think Microsoft are quite open to modding. It all depends on the company. So, like like Dan said, any Nintendo mods will get taken down straight away, and other companies are more open to it. So it all depends on the console and who kind of owns it. You know.
Yeah, avoid talking about Nintendo at any cost usually, because they'll come for you. I've got a question here from Richard Sheriff. What effect do you think old publications like Amiga Power had in developing the communities around these machines that still exist today?
Well, I think, you know, the magazines back then were central to it, you know, especially in that pre-internet era. That was really the only way that you knew other people around the country and around the world, kind of share your passion, and also where you go for not only to find out news that's going on, but to find out whether games were worth buying as well. I mean, I remember, you know, when I was a kid and a teenager, I would pretty much spend all my money on magazines. I'd go into the newsagent, nag my dad, you know, can I have this one this week? And I must have got about 7, 8 a month. They weren't cheap back then either. But I think now that we've obviously all moved online, it is cool to have magazines like Retro Gamer and Amiga Addict running today, you know, for those of us who appreciate a real magazine. But I think definitely that's where those kind of communities were originally formed. I mean, I remember reading, there was a magazine called Amiga Format that was kind of the best-selling Amiga mag. And bearing in mind Commodore, the company that made the Amiga, went bust in 1994. That continued until the year 2000. You can still buy it in W.H. Smith up until 2000. But by the end of it, it really become a community-focused magazine where, rather than visiting, like, you know, the companies that made the games, they're going around user groups, or they're going to like small indie studios who are making games and hardware and software. And when they got into online, they had, like, you know, Yahoo groups where all the readers would go into, and that morphed into forums and Facebook groups later on. So I think definitely that was a big part in developing the communities in the pre-internet era.
I think they also helped. It's weird because Commodore left the Amiga and a lot of the companies dropped out, but there was still this huge kind of hope for it and huge group of people really looking forward to the Amiga, still thinking it's a new kind of piece of technology, and the delusion continued with the magazines. They like pushed the delusion on to about year 2001 and still said we're the best, even though like PlayStations were coming out and other systems. And I think that has actually extended into the modern day stuff, which is spurring people on to, you know, show that they can be the best and push the system to absolutely mental like limits and levels unheard of before. And just the reason they're doing it is because they've still got that kind of, I don't know, you know, we're on top even though you're not. It's like a weird kind of thing. But the magazines, you know, there weren't many games coming out at the time, so there was a point at when anything came out, they'd be like 90%, 90%. And it was like, no, those games didn't deserve that. But it was just a new game for the system. That was the whole thing. So, yeah.
I think we've got a question from Neil. I think you've raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself, or we can unmute you and then pose your question?
Thank you. Just a big fan of podcasts, so I'll put my hand up. Really enjoy it. I spend a lot of my time working with trainee teachers and also, as you might hear in the background, homeschooling the kids. I'm sort of thinking more about how actually it's important we teach children that this stuff does have a history and that it was part of how the devices we use today developed. Do you have any opinions on whether perhaps this is a bit too specialist maybe, or is it something that should be part of what kids know?
I always think because we used to do all the talks at Play Expos, you know, around the country when they were still on before COVID struck. Hopefully it's going to be back again next year. But I remember then, when we go to a lot of retro gaming events, you'd often see mums and dads with their kids. And it was always quite a warm feeling seeing like a dad and his son and daughter sitting down playing a machine that he had when he was a kid, or like a mum and the kids on an arcade machine that she grew up playing, and the kids actually being interested and sitting down. So you've got to remember, I mean, a lot of these games were really made for children back then. And I think the things that attracted us as kids to them, even though today, I mean, you know, my 6-year-old nephew, can't get him off Fortnite, he's obsessed with it. But then if I put something on like Double Dragon on my Switch, he'll enjoy playing it with me, you know, because again, what attracted me to it as a child, those bright colors, the music, the fun of the game, still works for kids today, I think. I think the danger is, I mean, I sometimes kind of equate it to the dad who was into, you know, 70s rock music, trying to get his 13-year-old daughter into it because it's proper music. There is a bit of that. I think you've got to let kids explore and be part of their generation. But if they show an interest in kind of, you know, what mum and dad grew up with, I think that's awesome as well.
It's really interesting. I think there's a bit of a duty because, you know, technology is a huge part of our lives and gaming and how this all developed. And I think there is a duty to kind of tell kids, you know, these are the roots of it. Like Bletchley Park's an amazing place to kind of see the roots of technology there. But it's like the driving test. You know, they had to introduce stuff into the driving test, like how to change your oil, check the tread on your tire, all of this stuff, because people were disconnecting. And I feel that a bit with stuff like mobile phones and apps. You know, to some people, Facebook is the internet. You know, they don't have a wider understanding of that, or even that, you know, there's cables underneath the sea that the internet's traveling through. And it's just understanding those kind of roots in technology, because we're going to get to a point that if we don't educate enough people about it, then there's going to be no one left to repair it. You know, I think that's definitely important.
I also think, you know, the popularity of technology today, and there are always going to be those kids who will look at something and think, how does that work? You know, I used to be the kid that took the video recorder to bits just to see how it worked and could never get it back together. But there are always people with inquisitive minds, and especially now gaming's everywhere as well. I mean, there are obviously kids still who look at it and think, I want to make that. How do I get into that industry? It's great. So it is fantastic that we have things like the Raspberry Pi where they can affordably get into making their own games, that kind of thing.
Cool. Thank you, gents. Yeah, hopefully can do a PhD on it at some point, but not this month. Got bills to pay and homeschooling to do first. Thank you.
Oh, good luck.
Thanks, Neil. The final question, because see again, how does time work? I don't know. We've got the question from Lex. Yeah, you've spoken a lot about sound and music. This is quite a provocative question I can see incoming. Do you have any strong opinions on modifying consoles, especially from a preservation perspective? Things like pro-sounding your old DMG Game Boy, installing backlights, adding a link cable to a Super Game Boy, circuit bending a Master System. Is it sacrilege or a fun experiment? I
think if you're working in a museum and you want to display it, it is a bit sacrilege, yeah. You need to have the original machine. You need to, if there's modifications made to just keep it working, I think that's fair dues. But having like the original display, I saw one recently where they had Andy Warhol's pieces that were being displayed, and you know, they had a CRT monitor, and they ripped out the whole guts and then put a flat screen monitor in there and stuff. I thought, oh, sacrilege. But in regards to people at home with their own private collection, I think do what you want to do. If you could bring a new, cool, interesting function to a machine, or a new sound, or find something new, then why not? You know,
I think it's more about how common the hardware was as well. I mean, if you've got, like, you know, like you said, if you've got the only, like, say someone has got the only prototype of something in the world and they make changes to it, that's probably going to annoy a lot of people. That would. So
it's a good way to enrage people online.
Yeah. But if you've got something like a Game Boy where they sold, you know, millions of them, and you want to put a nicer screen in there and things, I think, you know, more power to you. I mean, I've got a few machines, like I've got a Sega Game Gear. And an Atari Lynx as well, that my Lynx screen now is, I've got to kind of angle it to see it. It's really bad. And there are people that make nicer screens for it and stuff. And that might be something I do eventually, you know, just because at the moment I'm not using it because it's so bad to look at. So why not improve it and make it a better system?
I may make a suggestion to Lex that some viral marketing for the museum could be to find our most precious item in the collection and threaten to do something nasty to it.
Like add a spoiler or go faster strike.
Well, Dan and Ravi, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I feel like it's been fun. Yeah, it's been fantastic.
Yeah, our pleasure.
I don't know how. I mean, how do you do hand clapping your hands to someone in a virtual meeting?
Let's all just clap. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, imagine everyone doing it.
Yeah. I can see the hand emoji, so I'm sure that works. So thank you both for joining me. Thank you to everyone for your really insightful questions. Thank you for the moderation team as well for making this possible and helping me out a lot. So thank you very much. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we go. So hopefully this will be uploaded to our website and YouTube. If you're not a member of the VHS, again, I think the link's in the chat. It's the vhs.themvm.org. There's an application to join the VHS at the bottom of the page. It's a really great and growing community of like-minded preservationists and enthusiasts and collectors, and it's been great fun so far. I'm delighted to say that the next VHS event will be on the 30th of March. With digital curator Fatini Aravani, and from the Museum of London, and we'll be talking about the trials and tribulations of creating an exhibition on London in digital games. So I'm really excited about that, and I hope everyone enjoyed the event, and I hope you all stay safe and well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.